The invention of the camera forever changed the way we see our world. For centuries, great ships had been depicted in classical paintings, but suddenly their glory could be captured in stunning detail as they looked in real life. But just as the world's ships could be captured in their glory years, so too could their final moments. As the 20th century rolled on, some truly spectacular footage was captured on film showing what happens when things go wrong and ships sink. From First World War dreadnoughts to modern-day cruise ships, the camera sees all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are real sinking ships caught on film. First on our list is a mammoth battleship from the First World War that met her tragic end after just a couple of short years in service. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had begun to rapidly expand its naval power in the lead-up to the First World War. The realization had been that many of its ships were capable only at coastal defense, but a war with Italy would mean battles at sea, the scale of which that nation had never really fought before. Archduke Franz Ferdinand took direct interest in the navy since he had served in the position of admiral. It was his influence which sparked the sudden expansion for the empire, which had never really taken much interest in warships at all. A plan was put forward for the construction of a new class of battleship, a modern dreadnought that could serve Austro-Hungary, but before details could be finalised, a leak saw the proposed design published by the press, and an immediate reaction from the Italian navy. They laid down their own modern dreadnought design, the bizarre-looking Dante Alighieri, in anticipation of the Austro-Hungarian design, and the naval arms race between the two nations only intensified. The game was afoot. Rather than commission the new ships overseas, the Austro-Hungarian government commissioned a local shipyard at Fiume, now modern-day Croatia, to build the 4 ships of the class. Now these things were monsters and far larger and more expensive than anything the nation had produced before. In January 1912, the keel was laid down for the last of the class, and just 2 years later she was launched. The Szent Istvan was a 499-foot-long, 20,000-ton dreadnought with 4 turrets mounting 3 12-inch 305mm guns each. Now, this represented a whole new era for the Empire, and they were justifiably proud of their creations. They were the first dreadnoughts ever built by the Empire, and they would soon prove to be their last. In 1914, Ferdinand, the driving force behind the Austro-Hungarian Empire's navy, was infamously assassinated in an attack which inadvertently sparked the largest war the world had yet seen. Suddenly, Europe's powers raced to put the machines and technologies they'd developed into combat, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was out for blood. Szent Istvan and her sister ships proved too valuable to be lost, though. Their sinking would be a huge propaganda blow. Instead, they spent much of the war bottled up in their ports. In 1918, an audacious plan was developed to break the Allied stranglehold on the Empire's position in the Mediterranean. Istvan and her sister ships would spearhead a powerful force designed to smash through the Italian, British, and French ships which were keeping the Empire's navy in check. On the 10th of June 1918, at around 3 a.m, Italian torpedo boats were spotted by the force, but their speed and the night's darkness made it difficult for them to be tracked. They sped through the escorting cruiser's screen and fired off their payloads. 2 torpedoes struck Szent Istvan with powerful explosions that rattled the ship and opened her hull up to the water. The crew rushed to conduct damage control, but the rate of flooding was simply too great, and soon power was lost as the ship's boiler and generator compartments were flooded. Szent Istvan began to roll to one side, and so desperate was her crew to correct the list that her gun turrets were turned to port, but it was all in vain. Her crew gathered on deck to counterweight the list, and the ship's chaplain delivered a final blessing. Then, with a camera rolling on Istvan's sister ship stopped nearby, the ship rolled over, throwing hundreds of men into the sea. She came to rest perfectly upside down, with her belly pointed straight at the sky, before slowly, as flooding waters roared through her interior, the ship settled and disappeared from sight. One of the Austro-Hungarian Navy's finest ships was gone, and around 90 men were lost with her. The numbers could have been far deadlier, but fortunately the ship had simply taken so long to sink that most of the crew had managed to make it topside without being caught out far down below. The incredible piece of footage filmed by a lieutenant on the Istvan's sister ship, Tegethoff, was supplemented by more film shot by an Austro-Hungarian camera crew, and the video captured a very important piece of history. In fact, this is one of only 2 existing pieces of moving picture film to capture the sinking of a battleship at sea due to combat. The devastating loss of the Istvan rattled morale, and the raid on the blockade was called off. The Austro-Hungarian Navy spent the rest of the war mothballed in their harbours, and with the end of the conflict in November 1918, the empire itself collapsed. Interestingly, the Italian torpedo boat, which had sent her to the bottom, the MAS-15, still exists today on display in Rome, but arguably the most important legacy of the warship is the film footage which paints a captivating picture of the mighty dreadnought's final moments. Not all casualties of war were intended targets, though. A few ships have found themselves in exactly the wrong place and time with devastating consequences. One of these has been almost forgotten to history, but the toll in human lives caused by its sinking is enormous, with nearly 3 times as many people lost as were killed when Titanic sank. The Kiangya was a ferry completed just before the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. The ship was very small, only about 2,100 tons, and designed to service the myriad waterways around the northeast of China, where the mainland is hugged by islands like Zhoushan. The little ship survived the Second World War unscathed, but all throughout, China itself was suffering intense political upheaval. The Civil War saw China's Communist Party engaged in a bitter war against the old government, and soon the Communists began to make huge territorial gains. In 1948, their advance on Shanghai and its surrounding areas was so rapid that civilians were desperate to flee. The ferry, designed only with a maximum capacity for around 1,200 people, was absolutely crammed, with perhaps as many as nearly 4,000. The exact number can never be known because despite the existence of an official passenger manifest, the sudden rush of desperate and panicked civilians resulted in the embarkation of hundreds and hundreds of stowaways and their families. Kiangya set off for Ningbo on a voyage of around 112 miles or 182 kilometers, but then, while underway, there was a tremendous explosion that rent the ship in half and sent her to rest awkwardly on the shallow bottom in mere seconds. The sudden explosion and rapid inrush of water caught hundreds completely unawares, with the result that there was absolutely no chance of escape. A news camera captured scenes as salvagers attempted to rescue the living and retrieve the dead, but it was an enormous job. This tiny ferry had sunk with the death toll sitting at around 3,000 souls. There were only 700 survivors. The dramatic footage captured Kiangya stranded on the bottom with her upper works protruding above the surface of the water. But what had so violently exploded that the ferry had broken apart? Well, tragically, it seems that a Japanese mine laid years before, during the Second World War, had remained adrift and armed, that Kiangya had struck it and gone up, with the result that this tiny Chinese ferry stands today as one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Remarkably, Kiangya's hull was salvaged, repaired, and rejoined. The ship actually went on to have a 24-year-long career before being broken up for scrap. But the story of the little ship and the terrifying footage of her loss stands as a tribute to the hundreds of lives lost the day Kiangya found itself in the wrong place and the wrong time. Now we come to one of the most famous ship sinkings of all time, but not because of the number of lives lost. In fact, nobody died in this disaster at all. Instead, what makes this ship sinking so special is that the dramatic footage captured on film shows in full colour the process of a large passenger ship sinking from start to finish. This is the story of the legendary Oceanos. Oceanos began her career as the French liner Jean Laborde, one of a handsome class of ships designed to connect France and the tiny island nation of Mauritius, far off the coast of eastern Africa. Mauritius had once been a French colony, but despite more than a century of British rule, it still had strong French ties. Jean Laborde was a small but modern liner, around 14,000 tons and just over 500 feet or 153 metres long. Over the course of a few decades, Jean Laborde served under a string of new owners until finding herself under the control of Epiratiki Lines, a Greek operator of cruise ships whose post-war business model essentially centered around the idea of converting old liners for Mediterranean cruising. They bought the old French liner and renamed her Oceanos in 1976. Years later, in August 1991, the ship was chartered for a cruise out of South Africa from East London to Durban, but she almost immediately ran into rough weather and strong headwinds. Being lashed by 40-knot gusts and enormous waves, the little cruise ship forged ahead, pitching and rolling madly. With conditions worsening and the ship being battered by the ocean, there came panic from crew as flooding was discovered deep in the Oceanos' bowels. Constant impact from huge waves had damaged a critical pipe, which now began to allow water to surge in through the hull and throughout the lower compartments. Suddenly, the ship's engine room was overwhelmed, and Oceanos lost power. This remarkable footage, taken from a news helicopter, shows Oceanos as she slowly began to succumb to the waves. The previous night, the ship's crew failed to alert passengers to the severity of the situation, and then even saved themselves without lowering the lifeboats. It was one of the entertainment staff, Moss Hills, who coordinated an evacuation that saw every single passenger safely taken away from the ship, first by boats, but later by rescue helicopters which winched people to safety. Cameras rolled from above as the empty Oceanos began to settle by the head, empty of passengers and crew, but still a tragic sight as she was swallowed up by the massive swells. Water burst through doors and windows and began to pull the ship under until at last her stern swung skywards, pointed dramatically at the sky, and then roared under with a huge rush of air and dust from deep inside the ship. Moss Hills and the other entertainment staff members were quickly recognised for their bravery, while Oceanos' captain and crew came under intense media scrutiny for their part in abandoning ship before passengers even knew what was happening. The news footage of Oceanos' sinking gives us a very rare and deeply poignant look at a ship in its final moments in full and vivid colour. For all the famous and big-name ships that have sunk on film, there are plenty of lesser-known ones that have done so as well. Take, for example, the SS Ratia of the Hamburg America line. Built in 1883, this small German liner was originally one of a class of 4 350-foot-long liners capable of transporting around 900 passengers across the Atlantic. She was sold to the US government, rebuilt, and by 1916 was known as the USAT Sumner for use as a transport with the US Army. That year, Sumner was steaming off New Jersey when she was caught in horrible weather. Battered and thrown around by the waves, the ship slammed bodily into Barnegat Shoals. At first, the ship was only stuck on the rocks and there was hope that she could be refloated at high tide, but the punishment didn't end there. With the seas still surging and the ship stuck fast, Sumner's back was dramatically broken. This rendered Sumner a total loss, and there was simply no hope for her. In fact, there wasn't even time for salvage. The relentless force of the ocean broke the ship up entirely, and she was gone soon after. Another series of disasters that was regularly filmed back in the day were collisions. The busyness of some of the inlets and waterways leading up to some of the world's biggest ports resulted in some pretty catastrophic incidents. In 1937, the freighter Edward Luckenbach was making its way along the Columbian River when, in a harsh rainstorm, she shuddered and trembled momentarily before continuing on her way. To her horror, her crew discovered they'd actually collided with the Italian vessel, the Feltre, which had quickly sunk to rest on the riverbed. Luckenbach, for her part, had her bow smashed in and limped along before her crew temporarily beached her to prevent a full sinking. With Feltre sunk to the bottom, a tug and another steamer came alongside to safely evacuate the more than 40 people on board. Just over 10 years earlier, in 1926, the pleasure steamboat Washington Irving was the flagship of the Hudson River Day Line. Built in 1913, the classic-looking riverboat ran a regular service between Albany and New York City until the fateful day she was sunk. In a dense fog, the Irving set out as usual, but her crew struggled to see through the thick mist. With her whistle ringing out a shrill sound, the steamboat slowly felt her way ahead when suddenly the inevitable happened. A Moran Company tug surged out of the fog hauling 2 massive coal barges. One of the barges, with an enormous momentum behind it, slammed straight into the Irving's hull and hauled it. The steamboat's captain, realizing the end had come, jammed the boat's whistle so it sounded all the way through. Other boats from all around could hear the shrieking steam whistle and headed towards the scene of the accident. In the end, around 200 passengers were safely evacuated, but the Irving was filmed sunk down to her superstructure, a truly pathetic sight. Amazingly, the wounded vessel had been guided towards a pier on the Jersey side of the river where the passengers could alight, but tragically 2 were killed, including a mother and her 3-year-old girl. Eventually, the ship was raised and scrapped, and her days of majestically sailing the Hudson River were over. Finally, we come to one of the most heartbreaking scenes for oceanliner nerds like me, the burning and partial sinking of the SS Normandie, an icon of the Art Deco era which burned dramatically in full view of all of New York City. SS Normandie was a palatial oceanliner designed and built in the late 1920s, intended to be a true ship of state. The liner embodied all the finest that French artisans and craftsmen could create. She was intended to snatch the blue ribbon at last from Britain and Germany. Normandie burst onto the world stage and with her powerful turbo-electric engines roared across the Atlantic for a record-setting run that saw her emerge as the fastest and most prestigious oceanliner in the world. At nearly 1,030 feet long and 80,000 gross registered tons, Normandie's hull was simply enormous, and French Line wasted no time in filling it in with the absolute finest luxury they could manage. Normandie today is remembered for her palatial, almost gallery-like first-class interiors, which featured stories, tall ceilings, and smoking rooms and dining saloons lined with ornate Lalique crystal chandeliers and light fixtures. Clever design choices meant that the ship's interiors continued for nearly the full length of the vessel uninterrupted. Fine art graced nearly every aspect of the ship's first-class accommodations, but equally impressive was the technological leap that Normandie represented. Not only were her turbo-electric engines extremely modern, but she featured an impressive fire suppression system that made use of pumps and indicators that could help crew determine the source of fires and put them out. The ship had been largely designed by a genius Russian émigré, Vladimir Yorkovich, who, like other forward-thinking marine architects like William Francis Gibbs of the SS United States, well understood the danger of fire at sea and was committed to ensuring that his magnificent ship could never burn. With the outbreak of the Second World War and the Nazi invasion of France in 1940, the world's great ocean liners were frozen seemingly in fear, with many seeking shelter in neutral American ports. The SS Normandie remained tied up at French Line's Manhattan Pier 88, flanked by her rivals Queen Mary and the new Queen Elizabeth, for months. But then America was no longer neutral, because on December 7th, 1941, it was drawn into the war. The country seized Normandie with plans to convert her for US Navy service. Renamed USS Lafayette, the glorious ocean liner was slated to begin life as an enormous, fast troop transport to supplement Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth as they rushed to bring enormous numbers of troops from America into Europe out to the theatres of war across the globe. Normandie began to have her interiors stripped. All of her glamorous pre-war Art Deco panels and artworks began to be removed by an army of workers who streamed up her gangways like ants each day to take her apart. With many of the artworks and furniture off the ship, it remained for crews to begin dismantling the varnished wood panels that made up so many of her interiors, but then disaster struck. A welder's torch set fire to a pile of flammable life jackets, and the blaze began to rage out of control. It began to spread through the ship, aided by the varnished deco panels that had once been the delight of the transatlantic passenger trade's rich and famous, but which now acted merely as a very efficient fuel. Soon, Normandie was burning from stem to stern, and frustratingly, her advanced fire control systems had been deactivated. Even so, the US crews who had taken control of the great liner had no idea how to use them. Firefighting boats came alongside, and passengers from passing cars on the West Side Highway gazed in astonishment as one of the world's largest ships burned just in front of them. Firefighters and fireboats rushed to the scene and began to pump river water into the ship in an attempt at quelling the blaze. But soon this presented an even more dangerous prospect. With Hudson River water being pumped on top of the ship at an alarming rate, Normandie's upper decks began to strain under the weight of hundreds of tons of water. It drained down stairwells and surged through corridors, but made the ship enormously top-heavy. With nowhere to properly go, the water simply pooled way above the waterline, and slowly, surely, Normandie began to sag low into the river. Remarkably, in the crowd that had gathered to watch the blaze, a man stepped forward desperately and on a mission. It was Normandie's designer, Vladimir Yorkovich. He'd actually moved to the US just before the war, and now he watched on in horror as his creation burnt and listed dangerously. He rushed forward to present a plan which involved effectively sinking Normandie by opening valves deep within her hull. This would mean she could not roll over, and the fire could be put out before she could be eventually refloated. But tragically, Yorkovich was pushed to one side, and his ideas were rejected. US Navy Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews ordered firefighting efforts continued, and eventually the fire was deemed to be under control, but the Normandie was too far gone. He ordered the ship abandoned, and then, with a huge roar, the great liner rolled onto her port side and came to rest half submerged in the icy Hudson River. The side of the world's finest ocean liner, scorched and lying on its side like a monstrous beached whale, was front-page news, even at a time when German advances in Europe had dominated the papers since 1939. Admiral Andrews' ignorance had essentially led directly to the ship rolling, and news cameras captured the tragic sight in captivating clarity. The hulk still smouldered as the US government scrambled for answers as to how its newly acquired prize had been destroyed. Andrews' promotion to Vice Admiral was held for an inquiry, but then he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. Yorkovich was heartbroken by the fire, but he held hopes that the hull could still be saved and repurposed. He worked directly with US officials as part of the salvage operation, but then he suffered a second heartbreak. Inspection revealed further damage that meant salvage would make no economic sense. Normandie was sent to be broken up, towed down the Hudson River, a pathetic sight. She'd arrived in New York at war's outbreak as a complete, gleaming, magnificent ocean liner, and now, in 1943, she left it a charred and mangled mess. It's a painful story for ocean liner buffs because we all like to imagine what might have happened if she had survived the war. But fortunately, a lot of the ship's magnificent interiors and furniture pieces survive today on display in museums around the world. Painful though it may be to watch, the film camera footage of Normandie burning on her side is some of the most fascinating, grotesque moving picture of its kind, and the enduring legacy of the SS Normandie is that she became yet another ship sinking captured on camera.